Imagine you walk into a bank and see 190 billion euros sitting in a vault. That's roughly the entire economy of Kuwait, just sitting there, frozen. It belongs to Russia, but Europe's holding the keys. Ukraine is bleeding money, needs 130 billion euros just to survive the next 2 years, and everyone's screaming to crack open that vault and hand it over. Sounds simple, right? Justice served, problem solved, except there's a catch. Actually, there are about a dozen catches, and they're all ticking time bombs. Because what happens when you turn the world's financial plumbing into a weapon? What happens when the vault everyone trusts suddenly becomes fair game? Stick around, because by the end of this you'll understand why freezing Russia's money might go down as one of the most dangerous financial experiments in modern history. Part 1. The Frozen Fortune. Let's start with what we're actually talking about here. When people say frozen Russian assets, they're not picturing Fort Knox with gold bars stacked to the ceiling. This isn't cash stuffed in a mattress. These are digital entries, spreadsheet lines, government bonds sitting in custody at a Belgian financial institution called Euroclear. Here's the scale we're dealing with. Globally, there's somewhere between 260 billion and 300 billion euros of Russian state assets frozen since the war started in 2022. That range depends on who's counting and what exchange rate you're using, but either way, we're talking about ungodly amounts of money. Now, where is all this money? The G7 allies of Ukraine, countries like the UK, Japan and Canada, are each holding significant chunks. Japan's got about 26 billion euros. The UK has 27 billion. Canada's sitting on 13.5 billion. But here's where it gets interesting. The United States, the country making the most noise about confiscating these assets, about justice and reparations and making Russia pay, they're holding between 4.2 and 6 billion euros, that's it. Meanwhile, the European Union is sitting on 210 billion euros of frozen Russian money. And of that staggering sum, 190 billion euros, roughly 90%, sits in one single building in Brussels. One building. Euroclear, the Belgian Central Securities Depository. Let's pause on that asymmetry for a second. The US holds about 6 billion. Europe holds 210 billion. That's roughly 40 times more exposure. Keep that number in your head, because it explains almost everything that's about to happen. So what exactly are these assets? Before the war, Russia's central bank wasn't just hoarding rubles, it bought European government bonds, German bunds, French OATs, Italian BTPs, solid, boring, trustworthy debt issued by European governments, and those bonds were held in custody at Euroclear. Now here's the thing about Euroclear. Despite overseeing 37 trillion euros in securities, it's not some mega bank with fortress-like capital reserves. It's more like the plumbing of the global financial system, a cooperative with a relatively thin balance sheet. And this matters, because if Euroclear goes bankrupt, the entire plumbing clogs up. The whole system grinds to a halt. That's why Belgium, the country hosting Euroclear, treats even small legal judgments against it as existential threats, because they are. As of December 2025, roughly 90% of Russia's original bonds have matured and converted to cash. That cash is being reinvested in short-term instruments, mostly sovereign bonds with maturities of just a few months. And those bonds are generating about 3 billion euros per year in what they're calling windfall profits. The G7 has already been skimming that interest. Last year, they used it to back a $50 billion loan package through something called the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Mechanism. Basically, they're using future interest payments as collateral for loans to Ukraine today. It's clever financial engineering. But here's the problem. 3 billion euros a year doesn't cut it when Kiev needs 130 billion euros right now to survive the next 2 years. You can't fund a country's survival on bond yields alone. That's why the conversation has shifted from skimming the profits to leveraging the principal, from nibbling the edges to cracking the vault wide open. And that's a whole different ballgame. That's where things get complicated. That's where things get dangerous. Because once you start talking about touching the principal, you're not just skimming interest anymore. You're weaponizing the vault that everyone else trusts. And trust in global finance is everything. Part 2. The Reparations Loan. So how do you turn 190 billion euros of frozen assets into actual cash for Ukraine without technically seizing them? Enter the EU's proposal, championed by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Here's how it works. The EU goes to capital markets and borrows up to 140 billion euros. They use the frozen Russian assets as collateral. If Russia loses the war and refuses to pay reparations, the collateral gets liquidated to repay the loans. Technically, this isn't seizing the assets, it's leveraging them. The assets stay frozen. Russia theoretically still owns them. They only get liquidated if Russia doesn't pay up after losing the war. It's clever lawyering. Fans of the plan point to the seizure of Iraqi oil revenues after their invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which was authorized by a UN Security Council resolution. But here's the problem. Russia sits on the Security Council. Russia has veto power. They're definitely not getting a UN resolution for this. No legal shield, no path to legitimacy, just creative legal fiction. But there's a bigger practical problem. Banks don't lend 140 billion euros against collateral that could vanish in 6 months. And under current EU law, Russian sanctions must be renewed every 6 months with unanimous approval from all member states. One country, say Hungary, can tank the whole agreement. One veto and the collateral disappears. To get around this, the hawks are proposing what they call the double lock mechanism. This would flip EU law so that sanctions stay in effect indefinitely, unless a majority of member states vote to lift them. Right now, you need unanimity to maintain the sanctions. Under the double lock, you just need a majority to relinquish control of Russia's money, permanent freezes unless actively reversed. This is how they plan to make the collateral credible enough for banks to actually lend the money. Without this mechanism, no self-respecting bank is going to touch that deal. The risk is too high, the legal ground is too shaky. But despite von der Leyen's best efforts, Belgium is not buying it. The Belgian Prime Minister has called the plan theft and predicted eternal retaliation from Moscow. And honestly, can you blame him? Euroclear is headquartered in Belgium. If Russia retaliates, Brussels is going to be rather high on Putin's hit list, and he's got a point. Because Russia is already targeting Euroclear through the courts, this raises a fundamental question that nobody wants to answer. What happens when you try to borrow against assets that may never legally be yours? What happens when justice for Ukraine collides with trust in global finance? That's the gamble Europe is being asked to take, and Belgium is staring at that bet like it's Russian roulette. Part 3. Belgium's Nightmare. Let's talk about Belgium's nightmare, because this is where theory meets legal retaliation. In late 2025, a Moscow court ordered Euroclear to pay 4.85 million euros in damages to a sanctioned Russian bank called DOM.RF for blocking access to its funds. Now, 4.85 million euros sounds like pocket change when we're talking about hundreds of billions, but the amount doesn't matter. What matters is the precedent. Russia has established that Euroclear can be held liable in Russian courts for following European sanctions. Moscow can now file hundreds, maybe thousands, of similar cases, each one demanding compensation, creating legal liability, draining Euroclear's already thin capital base. Death by 1,000 lawsuits. That's the strategy, and it's working. Remember, Euroclear oversees 37 trillion euros in securities, but it's not a fortress. It's plumbing, fragile plumbing. If it goes bankrupt, the entire global financial system clogs up. Trades don't settle, bonds don't clear, the machinery grinds to a halt, and Belgium, hosting this critical infrastructure, treats that risk as existential, because it is. But Belgium's headache doesn't stop at lawsuits. There's also corporate retaliation to worry about. In retaliation for Europe's sanctions, Russia has seized power plants owned by Germany's Uniper. They've grabbed facilities belonging to French yogurt empire Danone and Danish brewer Carlsberg. Danone's yogurt factories in Russia now have a new boss, Yakub Zakharov, the 33-year-old nephew of Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov. Many Western companies have successfully exited the Russian market, but not without paying a heavy price. Moscow has turned Western exits into a fundraising scheme. Companies wanting to leave are forced to sell their Russian subsidiaries at a 50% discount and pay a quote-unquote voluntary exit tax. As of December 2025, European companies still have roughly $90 billion trapped in Russia. Compare that to $32 billion for US companies. Europe has far more to lose in a potential seizure war. That's why Washington can afford to be cavalier about asset conversion, while Brussels cannot. But Belgium's fear isn't just about lawsuits and seizures, it's also about diplomatic horseplay from its allies making things worse. Take France, for example. Paris is pushing Belgium to take this massive risk with one hand, while shielding almost 20 billion euros of Russian central bank reserves held in its own private banks with the other. Unlike Belgium, which publishes detailed Euroclear data, France has refused to even disclose where this money is. Client confidentiality, they say. Meanwhile, reports surfaced that Japan had refused to join the EU's lending scheme, citing legal risks. Tokyo furiously denied it hours later, calling the claims completely false. Whether it was a refusal or a miscommunication, the confusion suggests the G7 front is cracking under pressure. The main thread here is clear. Europe bears the risk. Others write the slogans. Belgium is being asked to stick its neck out while its allies hide behind lawyer speak and plausible deniability. And Brussels is not happy about it. Part 4. Insurance for a financial war facing legal assaults from the east and diplomatic flakiness from the west. Belgium has been desperately looking for a financial backstop. First, the government tried asking the European Central Bank to act as a lender of last resort. In a worst-case scenario, the ECB would print as many euros as Euroclear needs to stay afloat. That dream was quickly shot down by ECB President Christine Lagarde. EU law strictly forbids the ECB from financing governments or assuming their liabilities. The money printer is off the table. So the European Commission, desperate to win Belgium's vote for the massive loan to Ukraine, came up with a three-pronged insurance plan designed to prevent Euroclear from going under. First, a buffer fund built from existing windfall profits to absorb initial losses. Second, mutualised guarantees from France and Germany. If Euroclear gets whacked, Paris and Berlin share the pain. Third, they're putting the EU budget itself on the line as the ultimate backstop. Sounds good on paper, right? But Belgium still isn't convinced. The Belgian Prime Minister has been vocal about viewing Moscow's military defeat as, quote, a fairy tale. If he doesn't believe Russia will lose, he certainly doesn't believe Russia will pay reparations. Which means, from his perspective, the collateral will definitely get liquidated, and Belgium will definitely face retaliation. At least 7 EU countries are now publicly backing the European Commission's plan. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, Sweden, and Ireland. Not coincidentally, most of these are countries closest to Russia geographically. They're willing to risk financial retaliation because they view a Russian victory as an existential threat. Tanks rolling across borders matter more than lawsuits. Belgium, being comfortably nestled inside Western Europe, is less concerned about Russian tanks rolling across its border. Geography matters. The EU operates on consensus. Without Belgium, there's no deal, and Belgium is not budging. The core narrative here is simple: financial fear versus existential military fear. Frontline states fear invasion. Belgium fears bankruptcy, and neither side is wrong. Part 5. The euro on the line. Now there's another question hanging over this entire crisis, one even bigger than yogurt factories, beer and Euroclear. What happens to the euro if Europe starts seizing sovereign assets? Remember, Russia's assets are frozen, but nobody has crossed the red line of outright seizure. Yet. The euro is the world's second largest reserve currency, accounting for 20% of global central banks' foreign exchange reserves in 2024. Central banks around the world hold euros because they trust European institutions to respect sovereign immunity. The implicit deal is that you can park your money in euros without worrying that Brussels will steal it, because they don't like your government's foreign policy. Christine Lagarde has been advocating for the euro to gain global prominence amid sustained uncertainty around the role of the US and the dollar. She's described the current moment as a global euro moment, but that's not likely to age well if Europe just decides to pinch 190 billion euros, roughly the entire GDP of Hungary or Kuwait, from Russia. Such a move would demolish the trust and geopolitical credibility that underpins the euro's status as a global reserve currency. Once broken, it wouldn't be easy to put back together again, at least not outside of NATO's orbit. China holds substantial euro reserves. So do Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, and most of the global south. These countries have been watching the Ukraine conflict and the vigorous sanctioning of not only Russia, but also anyone daring to do business with Moscow. The sanctions regime has helped engineer a mixture of sympathy for Russia and suspicion of Western financial power. If Brussels can freeze and liquidate Moscow's assets for losing a war, what's to stop them from doing the same thing the next time there's a geopolitical disagreement? The answer is supposed to be, this is different because Russia is an aggressor state that violated international law, but that's a political judgment, not a legal one, and central banks making decisions about where to hold reserves don't trust political judgments. The ECB has been explicit about the risk. If foreign sovereign entities perceive that their euro-denominated reserves are subject to political conversation, based on executive decisions rather than judicial processes, they'll divest from the euro. And that causes a cascade of headaches for Europe. A sell-off of euro-denominated bonds like German bunds and French OATs would cause bond yields to spike. That increases borrowing costs for European governments, many of whom are highly indebted. Deteriorating confidence would cause the euro to weaken against other currencies and gold. It could ultimately lead to a global financial system fragmented into competing Western and BRICS-anchored blocks. Critics will argue, where else will they go? The dollar has its own weaponization issues. The yuan isn't freely convertible. Gold doesn't pay interest. There's no viable alternative. But the ECB isn't so confident. It maintains that even a marginal shift would increase volatility and borrowing costs for EU member states. You don't need a mass exodus to cause problems. A slow bleed will do the trick. This is why the Commission is so careful with language. They don't call it confiscation or seizure. They call it countermeasures, a term from international law implying legitimate self-defense rather than arbitrary theft. The reparations loan proposal maintains the fiction that the assets remain Russia's property until Moscow refuses to pay reparations. Whether markets care about semantic gymnastics is unclear. The practical effect is the same. Russia's money is being used against its will to fund Ukraine. Calling it leveraging instead of seizing might satisfy Brussels lawyers, but it probably won't mean much to Beijing. Belgium understands all of this. That's why they're treating this proposal as an existential risk rather than just clever financial engineering. The European financial system runs on trust that sovereign assets are safe, and Belgium, hosting Euroclear, would be ground zero for finding out what happens when that trust breaks. Part 6. America's Asymmetry. While Brussels is sweating bullets over sovereign immunity and reserve currency credibility, Washington is taking a very different approach. In late 2025, US Representatives Joe Wilson and Marcy Kaptur introduced the REPO Implementation Act, mandating the transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine on a regular set timetable. The bill won bipartisan support for its strong language about aggressor states paying for reconstruction. It frames asset seizure as a moral imperative. Russia started the war. Russia should pay for the damage. All very righteous. But there's something the bill doesn't mention. Who is actually holding Russia's bags? Remember that distribution? The United States only holds about 4.2 to 6 billion euros in frozen Russian assets. That's something like 40 times less than the 210 billion euros frozen in European custody. This asymmetry is why Brussels is freaking out. Washington is legislating about money it doesn't control, pressuring Europe to cash checks and take risks America doesn't face. The US can take the credit for dunking on Moscow because it bears minimal financial risk. If global South central banks start diversifying away from the euro, American exposure is negligible. But Europe holds the assets, Europe hosts Euroclear, and Europe faces retaliation from Russian litigation and corporate seizures. The Trump administration's pivot on Russia has made this even worse. Washington has been negotiating with Moscow without European input. America's budget contributions to Ukraine have evaporated. Europe is being forced into what officials are calling strategic autonomy, a diplomatic term for beat it, kid. So let's recap. The United States withdraws funding, negotiates separately with Russia, holds almost none of the frozen assets, faces minimal retaliation risk, and then passes legislation demanding Europe seize the money and deal with the consequences. Charming. This new REPO implementation bill is essentially American lawmakers outsourcing the hard part to Brussels, so they can act tough without paying the price. But here's where it gets even more cynical. To most of the EU, Russia's frozen assets are a forbidden fruit that should nevertheless be fed to a hungry Ukraine. To the US, however, the 300 billion euros is a bargaining chip, leverage to be traded away for a ceasefire, and one that looks content to throw Ukraine under the bus. This is all but confirmed by the 28-point peace plan floated by the Trump administration. Among the standard diplomatic language about ceasefires and demilitarized zones, it includes a proposal to invest some of Russia's frozen assets in joint US-Russia projects. So instead of giving the money to Ukraine, the idea would be to use it as a sweetener to bring Putin to the table, potentially unfreezing billions or reinvesting them in a way that benefits Moscow. The Kremlin has signaled it's open to this, hinting that they might accept the loss of some assets for reconstruction if they get to keep the occupied territories and regain access to the global financial system. And this is arguably the real reason why Europe is suddenly trying to rush this reparation loan through the door. By leveraging the assets now, Europe is trying to trump the war chest. If Washington trades away the assets to get a deal, Europe is left with the worst of all worlds. A hostile Russia on its border, a shattered Ukraine to rebuild, and no Russian money to pay for it. But if the EU can successfully issue 140 billion euros in bonds backed by these assets before a peace deal is signed, the money is gone. You can't trade away a pile of cash that's already been liquidated and fired out of a cannon. The main thread here is clear. Money as leverage, not justice. America can afford to play games because it's not holding the bag. Europe can't. Part 7. Why it wasn't a good idea. So let's talk about why this entire scheme, despite sounding morally righteous and financially clever, wasn't a good idea. Let's walk through the nightmare scenario that keeps Belgian officials up at night. The EU rushes to leverage the assets before Trump can trade them away. They issue 140 billion euros in bonds. The collateral gets liquidated. Ukraine gets the money. Justice is served. Except then what? Russia remains hostile. More hostile, actually, because now Europe has actually seized their money. Ukraine is still shattered, still needs rebuilding, and 140 billion euros doesn't fix a country that's been at war for years. And the Russian money? It's gone. Spent. No more leverage. No more bargaining chips. Meanwhile, the financial costs of rushing this through start to mount. Russian lawsuits against Euroclear pile up. Corporate seizures accelerate. European companies trapped in Russia lose billions more. The euro starts to wobble as central banks quietly diversify their reserves. Bond yields spike. Borrowing costs for highly indebted European governments increase. The whole system becomes more fragile, more expensive, more risky. Now let's add the humanitarian layer, because this isn't just about money. Ukraine's survival depends on financial support. Real people are dying, cities are being destroyed. The moral case for helping Ukraine is overwhelming. But global financial stability also depends on trust. And if that trust evaporates, the consequences ripple far beyond Ukraine and Russia. This is the tragic bind Europe faces. Help Ukraine now and risk the system later. Protect the system and risk Ukraine now. There's no clean answer. No solution that doesn't involve sacrifice and risk. Here's why freezing the assets worked in the first place. It was a middle ground. It put pressure on Russia without crossing the red line of outright seizure. It preserved the legal fiction that sovereign immunity still mattered, that international law still had teeth, even if those teeth were a bit dull. But leveraging those assets, turning them into collateral, liquidating them if Russia doesn't pay reparations, that crosses the line. That breaks the taboo. And once you break that taboo, once you establish the precedent that sovereign assets aren't really safe, if your government does something the West doesn't like, trust rarely comes back. China watches and thinks, if they can do it to Russia, they can do it to us. Saudi Arabia watches and thinks, maybe we should hold more gold and fewer euros. India watches and thinks, the West's rules-based order only applies when it suits them. Brazil watches and thinks, why should we trust institutions that weaponize finance? The long-term victims aren't just Russia. They're European taxpayers who'll pay higher interest rates on government debt. They're borrowers across the EU facing higher costs. They're countries losing faith in financial neutrality. They're institutions like Euroclear that become targets in a financial Cold War they never asked to join. Here's the final argument, the one that cuts through all the legal complexity and diplomatic maneuvering. This feels just. It sounds moral. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia should pay. That emotional logic is powerful and in many ways correct, but it poisons the system that feeds everyone. The global financial system runs on trust. Trust that contracts will be honoured. Trust that sovereign immunity means something. Trust that your assets are safe, even if your government makes unpopular decisions. Once that trust is gone, it doesn't come back easily. And the cost of losing it is measured in decades, not years. Freezing Russia's assets was a strong move, a necessary move, arguably. It applied pressure without destroying the system. But turning those frozen assets into a weapon of finance, that's the dangerous part. That's what wasn't a good idea. Because the vault everyone trusts isn't just about Russia's money, it's about everyone's money. And once you crack it open for one country, you've opened it for all of them. The question isn't whether Russia deserves to pay. The question is whether the price of making them pay is worth the cost to the system that makes global commerce possible. And that's a much harder question to answer.